Louis E. Kelly.
And welcome to the Robert Jackson Center.
Well,
This is not your first visit here to the Jackson Center, right?
no, we were here Monday.
Monday?
Yeah, that's right.
What'd you think of it?
It's very remarkable. It's a good museum for a great man.
What's your relationship to Jamestown?
I was born in Warren, Pennsylvania, and my parents, when I was 2, moved to Selrun. My dad worked for the Salisbury Axle Company, and then 1929 the stock market crashed, and we had to move over here on 11 Strong Street in Jamestown. And my dad and a man named Price and a man named Eklund started making floor mats out of automobile tires.
No kidding.
And I was 10 years old on December 21st when I was out in the evening about 20 below zero, walking up Fairmont Avenue towards Lakewood when we came to Jackson's house.
Where was that now? What was his address?
Right there on Fairmont Avenue, just across from Chicago Avenue.
Right.
There are big pillars on it. And I rang the doorbell, and when the lights were on, naturally everybody says, "Bob Jackson's home." That's the phrase around here. So maid came to the door, and she said, "Are you one of those kids from the school that's annoying us all the time, selling us tickets and so forth?" No, I says, "I want to see Mr. Jackson. It's a personal matter." "What do you mean it's a personal matter?" "Well," I says, "you tell him it's a personal matter. It's Louis E. Kelly out here." And I handed her my calling card. It said, Louis E. Kelly, salesman for the Wherever Mat Company. And so Bob Jackson was in the living room with his wife Irene, and they heard me arguing with the maid. So finally he says, "Helen, let the man in." She says, "He's just a little boy." I said, "No, Mr. Jackson, I'm a man, I'm a salesman." So I had a sample of a floor mat, and I told him about it. And at those days they had cocoa mats that made from the skin of a coconut, and the bugs would get in there in the spring and it would rot out by September. So I told him this was made out of automobile tires, and I told him the benefit of it. And when you stepped on it, any mud on your feet would go down through the seams. So he said, "That looks like a good thing." So finally I measured the front yard, or front entrance, and it took a 36-inch mat for his front door and a 24-inch mat for the back door. And Mrs. Jackson says, "Well, now, Bob, we've got Christmas coming. It's December 21st. We've got Christmas coming." I said, "Mrs. Jackson, that's why I'm here. They get money for Christmas." And so we started in, and he said, "All right." He said, "I'll take both, the 36. So I had to go across the street. My dad was selling on the other side of the street. And they came over, and he got me the mats. I went in, and they were heavy. I was 10 years old, and I was a little boy. So I got him there, and he paid me, and I thanked him. I left. So then that spring, my dad couldn't get enough money to buy the old tires from gas stations. You paid anywhere from 15 cents to 25 cents for an old tire.
What year would this have been, Lou?
1932.
Thank you.
December 21st, 1932. So in the spring, Carter Lyman, who lived up here on 8th and Lakeview, in the big brick home, that big mansion, he was the son of a famous doctor here in the area. I sold them baked goods. My mother ran a home bakery and peddled breads, cookies, muffins. So one day Mrs. Lyman says, "Louis, Mr. Lyman wants to see you." And I thought, what have I done wrong now? I thought the bread was good and everything. So I went in, and here he had a big coffee table with these polishing cloths on it. And he said, "I'd like you to take these and sell them with your other items." So here's the polishing cloth. Not the same brand, but that's the same type. So he says, "Now, we're in the worst depression of the history of the United States right now." And he says, "You see they're marked 50 cents, but he says, nobody will pay you 50 cents for them. We're in the worst depression." So he says, "I'm going to sell you these mats, these polishing cloths for 3 cents, And he says that you can sell them for 5 cents, you make 2 cents a piece. You sell them for 10 cents, you make 7 cents. But here it wasn't a big silver letter, was 50 cents. So I started out and I go to a house, but I went up in Lakeview Avenue and then Severn Parkway, Mount Eldor Drive and so forth, up in the better section of the town at that time, fancy homes. And people say, oh, that's wonderful. I'd ask them for a stained spoon or fork. See, in those days, practically every woman who amounted to anything had silverware. And this would remove the stain. So, oh, this is wonderful, see. But then I ran out of customers and the polishing cloths lasted too long.
No, we don't.
So a fellow named Don Benson, he worked for the Jamestown Paint and Glass down in Brooklyn Square. He was their route man. He told me one day, he said, I'll take you down to Warren, Pennsylvania, down to Kane and Bradford, and you can sell them down there. So one time I came home from school, my mother was crying. She said that she was down the last 3 coal scuttles of coal. And she says, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I got up early the next morning and went out hitchhiking. I got down on Foote Avenue, and a man picked me up. I got into Warren. Before long, I sold a couple dozen polishing cloths. Then got back in the exit there of Market Street and the city limits, and I started hitchhiking because I already left Mr. Benson that morning. So I started in there, and then I thanked him for it the next time I saw him, and so he said, well, you can go anytime you want with me. So I started traveling around selling those polishing cloths. But one day I went to Bob Jackson's house in the late spring when he was home on vacation from Washington. That was about the beginning of 1930, about the summer of 1933. And I showed him the polishing cloths. Boy, he went for those. He says, I can use this on my saddles. You know, the old saddles had a lot of brass and metal. And so I sold him a couple. And believe it or not, the next Christmas when he came back, he called my mother and said he wanted me to bring up a dozen more. So then the next summer, he called my mother and he says, I want him to come up to the Lakewood riding stables. And I went up there, and during the Depression days, there was a lot of these people around unemployed, you know, looking for a job. Anyone in government office, they'd just dive on them, you know, and have them see if they couldn't get you a job. So I got to the guardhouse there. They had it all fenced off because of Bob had a lot of notoriety in those days. People thought he was a great man. So they called up on the phone, and he says, that little Louie, he always called me little Louie. He says, if that's little Louie, send him up. And other people says, how can that little kid? One guy even says, that's a little snotty-nosed kid. How did he get in to see him? So I went up there, and he shook hands with me, gave me a big hug. And so I showed him the polishing cloths and sold him 2 dozen that time. Boy, 2 dozen. $6 a dozen? Wow. That's $12. I was rolling in the clover. So he says, you look like you're thirsty. So he bought me a Coke. They didn't have Pepsi or any of those other things in those days. He bought me a Coke and a hot dog. And so then, believe it or not, he said he admired me for my grit, the way I was arguing with the maid that day over not getting in to see him. And he says, I'll give you 4 letters to use in your life. And he says, you'll find out it'll work good. So he said, take the 4 Ds. You have to have desire to want to be something. You have to have the determination. Come hell, fire, and high water. These are his words. Be determined. Then you have to be dedicated to your work. And then you have to be self-disciplined. So you have desire, determination, dedication, and discipline. That was 1933, and I still use those same 4-letter words when I'm talking to young people today, telling about that. And then after that, every time I was selling anything, it didn't matter whether it was candy. I used to sell candy for the Old Homestead Candy Company of Springfield, Massachusetts. Whenever he was home, I'd go in and maybe sell him 3 or 4 one-pound boxes. And so one day I was peddling over here on bakery goods on Fulton Street. It comes down in here to 5th Street, and there was a sign in the yard, Ines M. Johnson, realtor. Here I was, 11, 12 years old. What's a realtor? I didn't know. So I rang the doorbell, and this woman came out, kind of red-haired, real pretty lady. She said, "I'm Miss Ines M. Johnson." And her mother was there, and she was using a cane. She had some deformity or bad thing. So I started selling her baked goods, and I said to her one day, I said, "What's a realtor?" "Oh," she says, "I sell houses. I sell farms." And she says, "I didn't start out that way." She says, "I went to work for the Atlas Furniture Company in the office. And in 1929, I was laid off. The firm went out of business." So she said, "I went to church." It was one of the Swedish Lutheran churches she and her mother belonged to. And they says, "Well, Ines, you know, you're a neat, clean person, well-mannered. Why don't you go sell real estate? There's a lot of folks now selling their farms, moving into the city and apartments. You could sell houses and farms and so forth." So she thought it was a pretty good idea. So she goes to the Jamestown Real Estate Board at that time. And I think at that time, to be honest, I can almost hear her telling me the thing word for word as it happened yesterday. She says, "These realtors laughed at me." The men laughed. They said, "Well, you're a woman. You're not allowed to sell real estate." "Oh," she says, "what does that have to do with it?" "Doesn't matter. That's the law." So she says, about that time, this man, Robert Jackson, was getting to be very popular in the area. And they shipped him down to Washington after Roosevelt went in. So she says, I went over and saw Bob Jackson in the Hotel Jamestown. I think it was Jackson, Herrick, Edson, and Leet. They were the lawyers. And I went she says, I went in there and I asked for Bob Jackson. I told him my story. He said, well, it was on a Tuesday. And she said he'd have to look up the books and he would notify her by Thursday whether it was legal or not for her to sell real estate. So he looked it up and he called her and come in. Yeah, he says, you can go to the real estate board, take your exam, you have to study and so forth. So she says, I went over there and they wouldn't let me in. So she says, I went back to talk to him and he says, he just reached over and picked up the phone and called somebody. He says, let this lady in. If she passes the test, you've got to give her a license. He says, if you don't, we'll call Albany, New York. That's the state capital. He says, we'll get you corrected in a hurry. So she got her license. And then she said she was at one of the meetings, the real estate meetings, 3 or 4 months later. And she says, they said, well, we'll give you a couple of years. You'll be out walking around the street selling apples. She says, before long, some of those real estate men were broke, and I was the leading salesperson, which she did. Do you remember that name?
I heard the name, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So she became, and so you go down these, what they call farm-to-market roads. And she says, you go down there, you'll see my sign in the yard, see, farm for sale. So see Ines M. Johnson. So then, every time Bob Jackson would come to Jamestown, by that time I had grown up and I went to work for Gearston Tool over here on 15 East 4th Street. They're now over there further west, but they used to be in the physician building. I was there. I was the first man hired in there by Gordie Carlson. So one day, Harry Ingleson, do you know Harry Ingleson? Yeah, well, I was a good friend of Harry Ingleson. He had 14 years of age. He got me to join the Epsilon Pi and the YMCA. So I went in there, and then one day, Harry Ingleson says, I don't want you to miss this Friday night because Bob Jackson's going to be here. So old Bob comes in and he puts his arms around me, hugged me. He was a great fellow, very friendly, and a real handsome man. See? So after that, when I joined I applied for membership in the Masonic Lodge. I was the first man in my family. Nobody for hundreds of years ever been in the Masonic Lodge. So then one day, when I was getting my 3rd degree, in the afternoon, that's when Harry Ingleson and Bob Jackson came in, and we had 2 women, Swedish women, a lady named Violet Anderson and a lady named Viola Carlson. And they, of course, they recognized me. And this little Violet Anderson says, you know, I almost wet my panties. I was so excited to see Mr. Jackson. See? So then, after that, every time he would come to Jamestown, I'd see him. So then I tried to find, whenever he was coming, for something to go see him. And believe it or not, he was such a humble man a great person, that he would take and sit down and talk to me, and he gave me advice. And then one day he says, "Louis, remember, if you're going out on the road as a salesman," he says, "integrity is the most important thing. Be a person of integrity and high ethical standards." Those were his exact words. I have followed that advice. Then when I got married, we were married 2 years when my oldest boy was born. And when he's 15 days old, the doctor said he had a very rare breathing problem. So we found out we had to move to Omaha, Nebraska. By that time, by that time he was about 11 years old, and then he eventually got well. But I was working right here up until Bob Jackson died. And then I had an appointment that day in Erie at the General Electric plant. But I went over, took care of the problem they had on the conveyor belts, got the problem solved, gave back. And just as I got back here, you had some men in the commandery that was honor guards. I wasn't able to be there, so I wasn't honor guard. But one man got sick. I don't know what happened, some type of a minor ailment. And so then I finally went up there and I helped out in the commandery there, the group there. So I was fairly close to the 8 justices. I don't think I was ever in somebody told me they took a movie of it or something, but I don't think I was there. But I cried like a baby. I just cried like a baby because he was a great man, very great. And
what's the importance of Robert Jackson to you?
He taught me the principles of good character, principles to live by. Now, one thing that I learned from him, besides many others, was that he had all the respect and admiration for every human being, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your religion, regardless of your occupation. And I know Dr. Hickman, you ever hear his name? Yeah, well, Dr. Hickman, you know, had a partner with him, and somebody came in to have what they thought was a minor operation on one of the patients, and Dr. Hickman was in some other room, and they couldn't, he had to turn it over to this assistant, and the assistant goofed up, and they had a lawsuit. But now, when Bob Jackson would come to town, of course, they'd always put a notice in the paper, and Dr. Hickman, I got to know him very well because he treated me. I lost the sight of my left eye when I was 6 years old, and I went there to him for 18 years before he passed away. And he told me that Bob Jackson, to his way of thinking, was one of the greatest men that we had in the whole state of New York, not just in Chautauqua County. But I have taken every newspaper article, everything I could find out about Bob over the years, and I have them all laminated now in Mesa, Arizona, in my own office. Yeah.
That's terrific.
Yeah. But then I got to know his son, William, and then he had a daughter, Mary. And then one day when I was down in Frewsburg selling polishing cloths, going door to door, that's when this woman, Mrs. Adams, told me that she was the sister of Bob. And so the day before yesterday, when we were down the Frewsburg Cemetery, I saw where they're buried right in the same Jackson plot.
This is terrific. Yeah. What a great story.
Yeah. Well, then, several years ago, a man named Gerhardt, I think it was, wrote a book on him. Right. And it was Christmas, and so my boys were small, and my wife on Christmas Eve had me this big box, and I opened up, and it was a book on this man Gerhardt had written on Jackson. And so I prize that. People say, can I take this home and read it? No. But you can sit here in my living room and read it. But don't mark it up. Don't tear a page. And so I still have that. And then about a year ago, a lady in the bookstore in Omaha, Walls Bookstore, told me that she heard that there was a book written about Jackson and Roosevelt, and I see you have one here. So I got that. But Jackson was what helped make me the man I am today. Now, anything that I do wrong, any of my peculiarities, are not related to Jackson. And my son is following in my footsteps. He also has a great respect for Jackson and the family. But I don't think the average person here in this town ever realized the true value of that man.
Well, I agree, and that's part of our mission here.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that this started. This is a blessing.
Yeah.
But you've done an excellent job. But you yourself have made a terrific reputation. I hear about you anybody I talk to in Chautauqua County here, they know Greg Peterson. Yeah.
Well,
And I call your mother and I tell her how proud she should be also. And she tells me she definitely is. And I felt bad about Lyle.
Yeah.
I knew him since I went to work for Westburg Electric. He used to come in from Jamestown Plating Company, electroplating there. He used to work with Siebert Johnson. So, yeah.
this is great. I appreciate you sharing this whole story.
Yeah. Well, anytime you want to get together with me, I'll be glad to come out because we're, right now, I wanted to come see. Tuesday night, I got my 60-year pin in the Masonic Lodge.
Great.
And in fact, Bob Jackson at that time told me that they could not ask a young man or any man about joining the fraternity, but he says, if you join the Masonic fraternity, you'll be the happiest man in Chautauqua County.